Okay, great. So we will go ahead and get started. Um, I noticed we already had a message in the chat about our tax credit bill. Some of you may know that they're debating our bill right now in the House. So feel free if you want to hop off and listen. You're welcome to do that. This will be recorded. We will be here doing this. So once again, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on Part 2 applications. If you've never used the tax credit before and you missed the last webinars, you may want to go back and watch them so that this information can be put into context. We hope you enjoyed the last webinar on the SOI standards. All of the webinars are now posted on our website for you to view. In this fourth webinar today, we will cover the Part 2 application and work descriptions. We will address how to effectively describe projects in the required format, how to reference photos, what types of architectural drawings are required. We will also discuss how to amend a project using an amendment form and how to phase a project. Like last time, we will go ahead and hold the more in-depth questions until the end of the webinar, or you can drop them in the chat. If you need immediate attention, please raise your hand and we will call on you and unmute you. And with that, we will go ahead and begin introductions. We are with the Office of Cultural Development, which is part of the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism under the Office of the Lieutenant Governor. My name is Andrea McCarthy. I oversee our historic tax credit program here. And then I will let Emily introduce herself.
Hey everyone, I am Emily Van Doren, and I am a tax credit application reviewer here in our office.
Hello everyone, I'm Farron Jones, and I'm another tax credit reviewer.
Hi, I'm Tristan, and I'm the administrative coordinator.
All right, thank you guys. We're going to go ahead and turn our cameras off so we can all just focus on the slides. So today we're going to go ahead and review our programs and partnerships before moving on to how to fill out the Part 2 application forms and how to pay your review fees. We will also briefly discuss the tax credit reservation forms. From there, we will review the best way to write out your work descriptions and what supplemental information you will need to include. Then we will go over the process of phasing projects. And finally, how and why to submit an amendment form. So let's begin with a review of our programs that we administer. We administer two programs, the federal and state historic tax credits. The federal tax credit, established in 1976 as part of the National Historic Preservation Act, provides a 20% credit on income producing properties. The credit is administered over 5 years, and there is a 5-year recapture period. The state program was established in 2002, most recently updated in 2023, and is currently being debated in the Louisiana legislature as HB 2. So we definitely encourage you to follow along with that and contact your legislators so that you can see what's going on with the current bill, which is currently set to eliminate the program. So we will definitely be scheduling something for everyone at the end of session, which ends on November 25th, so we can go over what changes did occur during this special session. But for now, we have a 25% credit, which is increased to 35% for rural areas. It's for income producing properties. The credit can be sold or transferred and therefore does not require tax liability, and there is no recapture period. The two credits can be stacked and used together. And in order to administer the programs, we work with the National Park Service, the IRS, and the Louisiana Department of Revenue. So now we'll move on to the part 2 application. We'll begin with the state application, which is 3 pages long. The first page is the property and contact information, as well as the signature line. The second page includes the project information, and the third page begins the work item descriptions. We will review all parts of these applications throughout the webinar, but it's important to stress that the first 2 pages are required, regardless of whether there is also a federal application and whether you have chosen to format your work descriptions differently. Here you see the federal application, which is one single page followed by the work description. Most of the information is going to be the same. And for this application, it's this first page that is required, while the subsequent pages can be included as an attachment rather than using the form fields. All right, and so here's a closer look at the project information that we will require on the Part 2 application. You must include the property data, such as the address and the district, as well as construction date and number of buildings on the property. Estimated start and finish dates are also required, along with estimated QREs. These are only estimates. The final information will be presented on the Part 3 forms. However, the estimated QREs will be used to calculate your Part 2 fees. We also require floor area, which is square footage, before and after, housing units before and after. This includes low-income housing. And finally, you will include your project contact info as well as ownership info. Be sure you are including a signature. We do now accept digital signatures and a date. And of course, your correct TIN or social security number. Review fees are charged for both the federal and state applications. Invoices will be mailed to you for the state application once we receive the application. These fees must be paid by check, and we must have them before we issue the final approval. We do not officially place your project on hold pending fee payment unless the review is complete, your 30 days are up, and we still not have received your fee. Here is our Part 2 fee chart. Note that there is an overall fee cap of $15,000 for the overall fee, but for the Part 2 fee specifically, the most you'll pay is $5,000. However, most of our projects are going to fall within the $250 or $500 fee range. Federal fees are also collected. No fee should be submitted until you are invoiced by the National Park Service. The invoice comes approximately 30 days from the date that you submit to our office, and that just reflects the 30 days it takes us to get it to the National Park Service. The fee will come from an email address with an nps.gov extension. The review clock on the federal program does not start until the fee is paid, which is a little different than the way we do things. So just pay attention to that. And here you see the Part 2 fee schedule for the federal projects. Now we'll quickly review the tax credit reservations, which was established in 2021. Available state credits are capped at $125 million each year, which is why reservations are important. Part 2 fees received after 2021 or later will require an approved reservation. An approved Part 2 is required before we issue approved reservations. Here you see a copy of the reservation form. Now, we did review this in our first webinar, so we'll just keep this fairly basic today. The form can be found on our website. The first 2 pages are straightforward with just your project information, and the third page is only for projects over $500,000, and this will require a CPA to complete. Reservations do not have to be submitted with the Part 2, but must be approved before the credit is certified, which is after you have an approved Part 3. Any increases in credit reservations can be handled by submitting an additional reservation form to account for the increase. You do not swap them out or replace the form. You just do an additional one for the increased amount. And if you tune into our next webinar in December, you'll hear more about this process. Finally, all the forms can be found on our website and emailed to taxincentives@crt.la.gov. And here's our website where you'll find links to the application forms themselves, as well as the tax credit reservation form. So now we'll move on to work descriptions.
The bulk of the Part 2 application is the description of the proposed work, which is sometimes referred to as the work narrative. The applicant presents in writing the scope of work for the project, which allows the reviewer to evaluate whether the project is likely to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, which is required to qualify for the tax credit. The entire project must meet the standards, so all work intended as part of the project must be included, whether it directly affects the historic building or not. In order to make the scope of work easier to understand, the description is broken down into individual work items focusing on specific materials, features, or spaces. We will look at some common work items shortly, but as an overview, work items should be ordered beginning with the exterior and working to the interior, and beginning with more general items, working down to more specific items. For example, large elements such as the roof, walls, and foundation will come before windows and doors, which will come before smaller details such as trim, light fixtures, and so forth. The way the narrative is organized, however, should be tailored to the specific building and project. You can use your judgment to determine how the work item should be structured to provide the clearest understanding of the scope of work in the most efficient manner. Pictured is an example of a blank work item from the federal application. The state application is structured in the same way, so everything we discuss going forward will apply to work descriptions for both programs. Each item is numbered in order and labeled with the feature that will be described. The date of feature field at the top right refers to the estimated date of construction or installation of the specific item. This is especially important for later alterations that are not original to the building. Just because something is not original does not necessarily mean it is not historic. So knowing the date of features helps us to determine whether they have acquired significance over time. The top box is for the description of the existing feature and its condition. A brief summary is usually sufficient. However, if there's any information that is relevant to the proposed scope of work that is not necessarily apparent from the Part 1 photographs, this should also be communicated. This could include the material of the feature, issues relating to its condition, or whether the feature has been previously altered. The Part 1 or 2 photographs that illustrate the existing conditions, as well as any related drawings, should be referenced. The reference drawing should include the specific pages and drawing or detail numbers that are relevant to the individual work item. The second box is for the description of the proposed work to the feature. We will discuss this section in more detail shortly. Here's just an example of a completed work item so you can get an idea of what that looks like. Listed on this slide are examples of common work items that apply to most building types and styles. Because no two buildings are the same, some of these items may not apply to your project, or there may be additional items that need to be added to this list. Remember, the entire scope of work on the project must be addressed, including site work, additions, and new construction. All buildings on the site, including any accessory structures, must also be included. If the interior of the building has similar finishes throughout, such as in a residential building, for example, interior treatments are typically divided into more generalized categories, such as wall, ceiling, and floor finishes. Some buildings may have housed multiple uses with different conditions existing in different spaces. In this case, it may make more sense to divide the narrative spatially. For example, in a historic school building, the entry lobby and corridors, classrooms, auditorium, and gymnasium, they all have very different finish treatments and interior characteristics. So the work items could be organized by use instead, with the corridors being one work item, the classrooms being another, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about what needs to be included in the description of the proposed work. First off, every description should start with the full scope of work that is being proposed for that work item. These descriptions need to be clear and specific. If alterations are being proposed, particularly those that might affect primary spaces or character defining features, an evaluation of why the alteration is necessary should be included. If the change is a result of a code, life safety, accessibility, or flood adaptation requirement, that is important information to note as well. It may also be helpful to describe what other options were considered and how the selected option meets the SOI standards. This is your opportunity to advocate for your proposal and provide any context or background information that may influence the reviewer's evaluation of a particular strategy. For repairs of historic materials, such as masonry, a project-specific description of the actual treatment that will be used needs to be provided, including means and methods and any particular products that will be utilized. Simply stating, for example, that the work will follow the Department of the Interior's Preservation Brief 2 on repointing is insufficient. There is flexibility in how the written narrative is presented. The goal is to present the information in the way that is most straightforward and clear to the reviewer. Some applicants find it easier to type their work descriptions into a separate text document, which is acceptable, as long as it provides the same information as the application form. Bullet points can also be useful for organizing longer work descriptions rather than paragraphs to break the scope up into more manageable chunks. The example at the right uses both of these strategies. The work item still includes all of the same components, including the item number, title, date of feature, description of current condition, and listing of relevant photos and drawings. And the lengthy work description has been formatted as a bulleted list, including annotated photographs in which specific areas of the photos are notated, highlighted, or circled, can help to provide a visual representation of existing issues or concerns that are being addressed. For larger or more complex projects, the National Park Service also recommends using your first work item as a summary or overview of the full project. Although this is not required for every project, it can help the reviewer to orient themselves before getting into the details of the work. Vague or subjective language, such as needed, if feasible, as closely as possible, and so on, should be avoided in work descriptions. Some examples are listed here, but this is not a complete list. Your interpretation and the reviewing agency's interpretation of these terms can vary widely, and ultimately, it is the reviewer who makes the final determination, and the reviewer's interpretation is likely going to be a little more conservative. Using ambivalent terminology to allow yourself more flexibility in the project is not necessarily going to benefit you, because at the end of the day, the completed work has to meet the standards. For example, if you apply to repair your wood windows if feasible, and then decide it is not feasible and replace all of the windows, you are not necessarily guaranteed an approval because the Part 2 was approved with this ambiguous phrasing. If the window replacement does not ultimately meet the standards, your project can still be denied. Your interpretation of what is feasible may be different than the reviewer's, particularly since our determinations are not based heavily on cost. The burden of proof is on you as the applicant, and if you do not provide that, it might not work out in your favor. So it is better to provide a very defined scope of work to ensure that all parties are on the same page. And if that scope needs to shift as the project moves forward, that can be addressed through an amendment application. Keeping this in mind, let's take a look at an example work description. This first slide is an example of a flooring work description that doesn't adequately communicate the full scope of work. Repair or replace existing flooring could have many different results. As mentioned previously, your work descriptions can be short, but they still need to provide enough information for someone who is totally unfamiliar with the project to understand what the final product is going to be. While this statement may technically be accurate, it is also so broad that it covers multiple interpretations, from minor repairs to wholesale flooring replacement. There is no indication of the amount of flooring that needs to be replaced, in what areas the replacement will occur, or what the replacement flooring will look like. Here, the work description has been fleshed out a little more, reading, repair or replace all existing wood flooring as needed. Where no wood flooring remains, install new LVP or luxury vinyl plank flooring. Install ceramic tile in bathrooms and kitchens. The material of the existing flooring is given, as well as the material of the new flooring that is proposed. We have a little better idea of where certain floor types will be used, although it still relies on the reviewer to refer back to the Part 1 photographs, which may not clearly show the conditions that the applicant is referencing. The use of the "or" statement still creates uncertainty as to the intended course of action, and since this statement applies to historic finish material, that could be a concern. In addition, although the description states that LVP and ceramic tile will be used, there is a wide variety of these materials that exist in the market. Some LVP or tiles may be appropriate for the age, period, and style of the building, but many will not be appropriate. This could also be a concern, particularly if being installed in primary spaces. Here we have a more detailed description of the work, which reads, repair existing wood flooring. Limited areas of deteriorated boards to be replaced with new boards matching the existing. Where no wood flooring remains in right side unit, install new wood look LVP flooring in a compatible plank width and finish color. Install ceramic tile in bathrooms and laundry rooms. Product information on selected flooring attached. This description is a little longer than the first and second descriptions, but is still limited to a few sentences and provides a lot more context. Although the applicant is still not specifying the exact amount of floor area that needs to be repaired, since this will need to be determined during the construction process, the language clearly indicates the majority of the existing flooring is intended to be repaired with only minor patching. This provides the reviewer with a greater degree of assurance that we're not going to see all of the wood flooring demolished. It's very specific about where new flooring types will be installed, and most importantly, specific product selections have been provided. Again, you may have a certain opinion on whether a certain product is appropriate or compatible, but it is the reviewer's role to interpret the standards and determine whether the product does in fact meet those standards. Providing product or material specifications ensures that you and the reviewer have the same expectations as to what is compatible and ensures that you do not waste money on a product that will not end up being approved. The last piece of advice I have for you is to take your time on the application and make sure your written work items are very clear, complete, and consistent with any additional materials you are providing. Writing these descriptions is not very fun. We know that everyone is busy, but taking the time to do it right the first time will set you up for success, both in getting an approval in a timely manner and making sure the project is ultimately successful and certifiable for the tax credit. Farron will discuss supplemental application material shortly, but keep in mind that these are only to help visually illustrate what you have already put in writing. The written description always takes precedence when there is a discrepancy, so everything you are doing needs to be put in the written narrative. It is your responsibility as the applicant to be clear and upfront about the work you intend to do so that we can provide the best possible feedback and ensure there are no issues further down the line.
Hello, everyone. So, as Emily mentioned, the Part 2 application is your opportunity to submit supplemental information. For the next few slides, we will go through examples of supplemental information and the best way to present it to us. Architectural plans and drawings are the most common forms of supplemental documentation. Please note that these do not substitute for written descriptions. Everything must be written out and detailed in the work items on the application. The approval extends to the written descriptions only, and you can reference the plans in your work items. However, the actual description needs to be written out. Helpful drawings can include an arrow or compass, numbered sheets, demolition plans, proposed plans, elevations, sections, and any other view that you might feel is useful to us. You can see here on the left, we have an example of a demolition plan, and on the right, a hand-drawn proposed floor plan. Product and material information. While details are important, we don't really need details on things such as furniture or fixtures. These items are not considered permanent and can be removed at any time. Therefore, we do not need to review those items. Some things we do need details of are windows, floors, and materials used for cleaning. Here you see a 6/6 window example, hardwood flooring, and a paint plan. You can't really read the print, but I have an arrow where the applicant discusses removing the paint. On the right, you'll see the material to remove the paint that was submitted for review. The removal of paint is one of those things that, if done the wrong way, it can significantly alter the historic fabric. You also might want to provide a visual view of the windows you're replacing, the location of the floors you're replacing, and so on. We also need to know where the plumbing and mechanical systems will be located. Often overlooked, the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing locations can alter the historic integrity of the building. Including these on your plans are extremely helpful. Supplemental photos. So you might remember these from the previous webinar. By the time of the Part 2 applications, many applicants have discovered unexpected issues or have already started the project. Please keep in mind that any work done before an approved Part 2 is done at your own risk. And if the work is already complete, it is too late to apply. With that being said, you might want to submit the work in progress photos along with your Part 2 application. We'd love to see the new issues, the progress, or any spots you might have missed in your Part 1 application. You can also submit examples of other houses that your construction team is gathering examples from. Sometimes a plan might not be available yet, especially for smaller projects, so feel free to submit the closest thing to what your work item might look like. Drawings. You might want to include roof drawings in your Part 2 application. Roofs are a distinctive feature that can alter the historic integrity of the building if altered too drastically. So I just gave a couple examples here. But like I mentioned in the previous slide, you can submit a photo of a roof on a neighboring house or what you plan to do with your building. Exterior additions. Proposed additions are a huge part of the Part 2 application process. Additions must differ from the historic building, and more specifically, rooftop additions must not overwhelm the historic massing. NPS's Preservation Brief 14 states, rehabilitation as a treatment is defined as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. And when the new work is highly replicative and indistinguishable from the old in appearance, it may no longer be possible to identify the real historic building. You see here on the left a colonial revival style house with an addition in the rear. The addition is not highly visible from the street, and the brick is compatible with the historic building. From the rear, you can see the addition's window pattern doesn't mimic the historic building. It isn't an exact match. The addition also doesn't have the same cornice details as the historic building. Too many matching details such as coins or dentils would make this addition too similar to the historic structure. In the middle image, you can see a glass and metal addition, which does not mimic the historic structure at all, but because it's tucked away in the center rear and essentially not in a public setting, this addition is appropriate. If this addition was proposed on a side elevation, it would most likely be different materials. The images on the right show additions that are not compatible or appropriate. The additions completely overwhelm the historic buildings. The height and the materials are inappropriate. Keep in mind you can submit a preliminary review before you submit an application if you think your addition might not meet the standards. Other supplemental items could be renderings of the new additions and anything else you might think is helpful for us.
Okay, so once your Part 2 application has been reviewed, there are 4 different outcomes that can happen. The Part 2 can be found to meet the SOI standards, to meet the SOI standards with conditions, or to not meet the SOI standards. The application can also be put on hold. If your Part 2 application is approved, It means that your Part 2 work description as presented appears to meet the SOI standards. If you receive an approval, you may proceed forward with the project and are not required to make any changes or submit additional information unless changes are made to the project down the line. Once again, this is a preliminary determination based on the written description. The completed project will still need to be reviewed to ensure the finished work does in fact meet those standards. The most common outcome is a conditional approval, meaning the scope of work appears to meet the standards if some minor modifications or changes are made. These provisos are called conditions and are provided to the applicant in a written list. In some cases, the conditions may require additional information be provided for review and an amendment. In other cases, the conditions just need to be incorporated into the work and compliance can be demonstrated through the final Part 3 photographs for project certification. An example of a state condition letter is shown on the right, as well as some examples of conditions that have recently been placed on projects by the National Park Service. I'll go ahead and read just one for an example of what this can sound like. So the siding on the front facade must be repaired, or if the condition is too deteriorated to repair, replaced with wood siding to match the existing dimensions and profile. The profile of fiber cement board is significantly different than wood clapboards. Fiber cement board may only be used on secondary facades that are minimally visible from the public right-of-way. That's probably responding to the applicant proposing to replace wood siding on their front facade with a fiber cement or hardyboard product. Conditions will vary based on the specifics of your project and what you're proposing. Conditions may request changes to the actual proposed scope of work, but may also be added when there's insufficient information on specific items or to clarify items when there are noted discrepancies between the written work items and submitted materials such as drawings. The fewer conditions that are placed on your project, the easier it will be for you as the applicant, since it is less likely that you will need to submit additional amendment applications to address these conditions. If your projects are coming back with a lot of conditions, you may need to take some time to review additional guidance on the SOI standards, or it could also just be a sign that your work descriptions or application materials are lacking or not matching up. On rare occasion, a Part 2 application can be denied. This typically means that the scope of work does not meet the standards in some major or fundamental way. These are not minor issues that can be addressed by adding conditions to the project. If the Part 2 is denied, that decision can be appealed in writing within 30 days of receiving the denial letter. If there are major issues, however, it is more likely that the project will be placed on hold. This will allow you to revise the design, if possible, before receiving an official denial. Part 2 applications can also be placed on hold if the reviewer needs additional information to determine whether the proposal will meet the standards. In the event of a hold, the requested information or revisions are sent directly to the National Park Service, federal projects. When NPS places a project on hold, they will send an email to the applicant with a SharePoint link to upload the additional information or revised documents directly to them for review. This is different than the usual submission process for applications and allows them to review the information much quicker. You will also need to send a copy of any updated materials to our office. If your project is placed on hold, make sure to read the hold email and follow the instructions provided. To reiterate what Farron said, we highly recommend not proceeding with any work on the project until you have received a Part 2 approval, when the scope of work has been fully vetted. If you begin without an approved Part 2, there is a higher risk that portions of the work will not meet the standards. Corrections may need to be made in order to receive final certification, or if that is not possible, the entire project could be denied. So please be cautious with how you proceed, particularly if you are new to the tax credit process.
When submitting a Part 2, you have the option of phasing your project. Project phasing was established by the IRS and the National Park Service as a way to expand the measuring period for meeting the substantial rehabilitation test. A project can be phased to increase that measuring period, and when there are 2 or more distinct stages of development. For those that do not recall, the substantial rehabilitation test is the way that the IRS calculates the minimum expenditure requirement and allows for a 24-month measuring period to meet that requirement. Phased projects are granted 60 months rather than 24 months. This is regardless of how many phases are established. On the right here, you see a project that was phased, with the first phase consisting of exterior work and upper floor apartments, and the second phase of work consisting of the ground floor tenant build-out. The IRS provides detailed guidance on phasing since it generally falls under their purview for federal projects. The guidelines state in general, the following requirements must be met to utilize a 60-month measuring period as a substitute for the 24-month measuring period. The rehabilitation may be reasonably expected to be completed in phases set forth in architectural plans and specifications completed before the rehabilitation begins. Second, a rehabilitation is reasonably expected to be completed in phases if it consists of 2 or more distinct stages of development. And finally, that there are written plans that describe generally all phases of the development. All phases of the rehabilitation process shall be treated as a written architectural plans and specifications and submitted with the Part 2. So this basically means that your phasing plan has to be outlined when you are submitting your Part 2, and that your entire project must be able to be broken up into distinct stages of development. We often get the question, can a project be phased after a Part 2 has been approved? And according to IRS rules, a project can still be phased as long as the Part 2 contains all of the work items and it still meets those requirements mentioned before. It has distinct stages of development. For this reason, we encourage you to phase the project at the onset if at all possible. The federal application will include details on phasing at the Part 2, and you must check a box if you intend to use the 60-month time measuring period. The details on all phases must be included in your Part 2. Please note that only a single Part 2 should be submitted, even for projects with multiple phases. At the end of each phase, you may request an advisory determination to ensure that the work up to that point meets SOI standards. However, it is not until the end of the project that the substantial rehabilitation test is applied, and then that the credit is issued. Just like with the federal program, the state program allows for phases, which require distinct stages of development. The phasing plan must be submitted with the Part 2 application. However, for the state, each phase must have a $10,000 minimum expenditure, because unlike the federal program, the state program allows for the credit to be earned at the end of each phase. However, if you are also applying for the federal program, you must get an advisory determination before we will approve the Part 3 for that phase. Be sure to register for our Part 3 webinar on December 11th for more details on this process. So to elaborate on when to use phasing, I have listed a few examples. In some cases, a roof replacement may be an entire phase of work. Stabilization may also be a phase. You may choose to break up phases based on different buildings, different floors, or uses such as commercial or residential. In some cases, the tenant may not be secured until the rehabilitation is nearly complete, so the specific tenant may be its own phase. However, it should be noted that demolition alone cannot be a phase. This is because the building cannot be left in a ruinous state. You can leave areas of the building alone and still move forward with phased work in other areas, but once you remove finishes and features, you must refinish the space before closing out the phase.
Amendments. Amendments should be submitted when there is any change to your application. If a federal project is placed on hold by NPS, they will usually provide instructions in the email about how to submit your changes. Go a little bit over that in the next slide. An application can have multiple amendments depending on the size of the project. Please note which number amendment you are submitting at the top of the application in the green box. The rest of the information on this page is basic ownership and contact information. Make sure you sign the application. The orange box shows the different options for an amendment. Updating basic info, additional info, amending a Part 1, or responding to a condition issued during a Part 2 or Part 3 approval. The image in the middle shows an example of an applicant responding to a condition issued during the Part 2. The condition asks for examples of the replacement flooring. The amendment responded to that condition. The purple box gives the applicant the chance to update the information on the application by adding or deleting items. So this might be something we did not condition, but it is no longer a part of the project. This is important because we must approve any changes along the way. The initial approval only extends to what was in the original application. The page after this allows for you to add and delete as many work items as you like. If the Part 3 is not appropriate and you did not submit an amendment, you may be required to submit remedial work. So like Emily mentioned with the work item descriptions, if you aren't clear enough, if you're a little too vague, that will unfortunately, be reviewed in the Part 3. So you want to try your best to get everything done in the work description so that you don't have to do amendments at all, really. The federal amendment form is similar to the state form. Please provide your NPS project number in the top right corner. One difference is that if you're updating the project data, such as start or completion date or basic contact info, that can be sent directly to NPS with an emailed copy sent to our office. So they have their email in the box line, nps_tps@nps.gov. And amendments are subject to the 30-day review period, like all other applications.
All right, so we will just quickly refresh you to our online submission process. Remember that everything goes through this process, federal or state, except for that one exception where you're submitting a federal amendment to update QREs, project contact info, or other technical items that don't require architectural review. All applications have to be submitted digitally. We do use a Google form, but we can work with you if you would like to explore other ways to get that digital media to our office. And finally, that wraps up this webinar. The registration is open for our final webinar on December 11th, which will be the Part 3 certification, claiming the credit, and we will have staff from the Department of Revenue on that day with us. So we will go ahead and go to the chat to answer a few questions. The first one we have from Becky asking if we submit a Part 1 before the upcoming changes, will that be impacted if the program ends? At this point, we can't say anything for sure. Like I said, they're debating this in the House right now. The current language states that you just have to have your Part 1 in before June 30th, 2025. So it's not going to end everything immediately for all projects. Just be sure to get your Part 1 in as soon as possible. The next question is, how do I check the status of my review? Emily, maybe can you drop the NPS TPS status search into the chat? NPS has a link that you can click on, enter your project number, and see where your review is in their review queue. Becky asked about it being too late to apply if the project was complete. That is true. However, if the project has begun you can still apply. Just be sure you're including all the work items in your part 2, not just where you are now. Michael is expressing some frustration with our state forms, which I do understand. The federal form does have a button to add items. That took them about a year to build. We just don't have the capabilities to do that. However, there is a very easy trick in Adobe. If you have form editor, you can reach out to me directly and I can show you how to do that. You just have to change the name of the form field and it will no longer copy that text automatically into your new boxes. And if things go well for us, maybe we will build some new forms for you guys. I think that's it. Does anyone else have any questions? This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as soon as possible. Otherwise, we thank you all for joining us. Charles, you can call us and we'll help you find out the status of your project specifically. And yep, that's it. I think we'll all go hop over and see what's happening in the legislature right now. So thank you all. See you next time.